Turning the corner to our latest section of the class, looking at the middle years, turning our attention to European social thought, specifically neo-Marxism. We're looking at how we are building on a previous theoretical thread. So compared to the last section of the class, the middle years American social thought, where we were looking at starting a brand new thread. Here, going back to Europe during the same middle year time period, we're looking at how people are continuing their previous thread. Specifically, we're going to look at people continuing the ideas of Marx and Engels, a continuation that's often called neo-Marxism. When looking at the updating of Marx's thoughts, we also see the neo-Marxists including other classical theorists. So when we get to Gramsci later on in our presentation, we'll see a focus on social status and power. So how some people with the proper credentials carry more legitimacy in their ideas and thoughts compared to other people who also have ideas and thoughts. But their ideas and thoughts are not seen as legitimate because they lack the credentials needed. Credentials like being a doctor, being a lawyer, being a state senator, congressperson. So that ties into Weber, and also we see the neo-Marxists incorporating some of Durkheim's ideas when we see the focus on how culture can contribute to social order, or how culture can contribute to social change. We'll see that focus of culture and order both in Gramsci and Benjamin's piece. Benjamin's piece will be the first one we go through. And then we'll see how Benjamin also looks at how culture can promote social change. So again, another tie into Durkheim. So both Benjamin and Gramsci are neo-Marxists, but they do incorporate other classical theory ideas from Durkheim and Weber into their own theories. What we see is a shift back to an emphasis on social structures and a top-down macro directional focus compared to the American social thought. And again, we get back to the idea of capitalism being a driving force behind the realities under examination. So the neo-Marxists are updating and applying the ideas that we talked about earlier in the semester with Marx and Engels, carry on that tradition of seeing capitalism as the driving force behind reality. So the neo-Marxists at this time period were dealing with two main questions. What is stalling the social evolution? So why haven't we moved past capitalism into socialism yet? And so some of this evolution has occurred. So we do have, public schools. We do have minimum wages. We do have, other kind of public services, Social Security, that are all kind of socialist programs, but typically we don't see them as such. So we can't say that, Marx and Engels are totally wrong because of, minimum wage, minimum kind of building health code requirements at work. All those things are kind of government interventions. And when the government is intervening in the capitalist system, that's what we call a socialism. So socialism has started to emerge at different times and different places, to different degrees in places, but nevertheless it's still there. But here the neo-Marxists are talking about why hasn't the ultimate change occurred? And then another question is, how can people resist the system? So how can the system be challenged? How can it be fought? Marx focused on worker organization, organizing in unions and fighting the system. Here, the neo-Marxists, when looking at both questions, why is the system stalling in terms of changing into a more socialist system, and how can people resist the system, the neo-Marxists highlight culture. So we'll be talking about culture a lot when it comes to the next two readings. And sometimes these individuals, the neo-Marxists of this time period, are referred to as cultural Marxist because they often tie together culture as a social structure and capitalism as a driving force in their frameworks. Walter Benjamin is a very interesting, a very creative social theorist. He likes to tie together different threads of social theory, philosophy, art, and sometimes the creativeness of his ideas make his ideas somewhat abstract, somewhat difficult to comprehend without going through it, 2 or 3 times. So what I tried to do is kind of break down some of his abstract ideas that to me are very interesting, and some of my probably favorite theories, but recognizing that they are kind of hard to get through when we're first engaging ourselves with his ideas. So that'll be my job over the next few slides to try to make that abstract nature of his thoughts a little bit more accessible to us, kind of the social introduction level readers. So we can say that Benjamin is a cultural Marxist, tying together again culture as a structural force and capitalism as a driving force behind realities. He's associated with what people label the Frankfurt School, just a group of thinkers and scholars who really paid attention to cultural production at this time period, connecting to media. So again, we're updating our time period to kind of the 1920s to the 1970s. Here we see media as a social institution growing, and as a result, its influence on society, its influence in terms of controlling culture, is growing as well. Focusing on the reading, Benjamin's piece, currently, we also are focusing on different ideas that relate to your next reaction paper. And so I've touched on some of that information already in this presentation, and I'll continue to touch on directly, indirectly, information that ties into your next reaction paper. So to start off with, when looking at Benjamin's piece, we're looking at a theory of social change. And so again, we're updating kind of previous Marxist ideas that we talked about. And although we can see maybe the commodity fetishism in here, we can see a little bit of that machinery and technology, but primarily the theory connects to the Communist Manifesto because we're talking about a theory of social change. So looking at this theory of social change, he's trying to explain the disruption of cultural authority held by the capitalist, the powers that be, how this cultural authority is disrupted through technological innovations. So looking at how the availability of new technology shifts power away from the capitalist to the workers. So how this works, cultural production is now open to the masses in ways it was never open to them before. So these new technological forms, such as film, cameras, recording devices, printing devices, all this makes creating culture, and by kind of cultural production, creating ideas, creating different messages to put out there for the public. So creating this culture of ideas and messages is now easier to do for the masses than ever before. So before, you had to own those means of production, and these means of production, the technology was very limited. You couldn't go to your Home Depot or Walmart or wherever and acquire this technology. But now you can easily get your hands on this technology that helps you create and distribute culture out to the public. And the overall availability of these technologies are a direct result of the capitalist desire to profit off of such technologies. So, in other words, the technologies are out there for the consumers, so the capitalists can make money off the consumers purchasing the technologies. But once the consumers, the masses, purchase the technology, they now have the ability for the first time to create their own culture rather than having to accept the culture created by the capitalists, the powers that be. So we'll look at two ways this availability of the new technology to produce culture disadvantages the capitalist. Thus, it's going to advantage the workers, the masses. And so the first way we're looking at how the capitalists become disadvantaged is how the ability for people, the masses, to make copies of cultural artifacts, to reproduce cultural artifacts, such as books and paintings. This minimizes, this lessens the aura of those artifacts. So when you have your own copy of the book, when you have your own copy of the painting, often that specialness of the painting and the specialness of the original book is lessened because now the viewer has more time to see and think about the reproduction, the copy. And when you have more time to think about it, when you have more time to just look at it, you begin to see it differently, think about it differently compared to when you're experiencing the painting or the reading in real time and space. So, in other words, if the professor is kind of telling you about the book and you don't have access to it, you have to take the professor's interpretation at face value. But now, if you can have your own copy of the book, you can spend time to think about it differently. You can look at it in your own ways, thus maybe not accept the interpretation given to you by a professor. And likewise, when you have more time to look at a painting rather than looking at it for a few minutes at a museum, you can start to look at it and think about it differently compared to when you're looking at the original painting in the museum kind of in real time and space. Now, just elaborating on some of what I talked about on the previous slide, I say, think about the difference when you're listening to something or looking at something live. By live, we're talking about in real time and space, versus when we listen to something or when we see something that's a reproduction or a copy. When we look at something that's a reproduction or a copy of the original artifact, often rather than being in awe as a viewer, we become a critic of the artifact. We start to recognize blemishes, we start to recognize maybe mistakes and faults in the copies, in the reproductions that sometimes we don't capture when we're looking at the original, hearing the original in real time and space. So a couple examples I put there in the slide. When I lecture, more or less, I think everything sounds okay. But when I listen to a lecture, such as these recordings that I'm doing, I hear many flaws. Again, when I look at my hands in real time and space, so kind of glance at my hands, I think, again, they look okay. But then if I see a picture of my hands or an image of my hands, a copy of them, then I start to see many flaws, dry skin, uneven fingernails, so on and so on. So this is what Benjamin's trying to get across. He says the cult value, the idea that we're in awe of something, we fetishize it, according to Marx. that cult value is overtaken by what he calls exhibition value. We look at things more as a critic, and we start to see it as being flawed, as being blemished. This is what happens when we look at reproductions rather than looking at the originals. So, overall, the literature, the visual, the performing arts, the cultural artifacts created by the capitalist class has less symbolic power over people when we have the ability to reproduce the artifacts and thus kind of critique the artifacts and see how perhaps they're flawed, how perhaps we can do something differently. The second way the capitalist class is disadvantaged as a result of the technology being available to the masses is that the masses, the workers, can now use the technologies to produce their own cultural ways, alternative cultural ways that perhaps resist, challenge the status quo, challenge the system as is. So Benjamin says the masses are no longer simply the reader of a narrative supplied by the powers that be, a narrative that you have to kind of take at face value, but now the masses can write their own narratives. They can use the technology to produce their own cultural ways that challenges and confronts the ideologies of the capitalist class. And these new technologies can be used ultimately to promote social change. You give people an alternative way of thinking, an alternative vision of the future, and with these new cultural ways, you can promote ultimate social change. So here you see Benjamin focusing on how culture can be used to change things, drive society forward. Thus, we're seeing the updating of the Communist Manifesto. Like in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says the capitalist system sets itself up for its own demise by putting the workers against the capitalist, making the working class grow so eventually it could take over the capitalist class. Here we see how the capitalist class sets up their own demise by providing the masses the technology that they will ultimately use to promote social change. Looking at our second theorist today, and Antonio Gramsci is also a cultural Marxist, so looks at how culture as a social structure ties into capitalism as a driving force behind reality. And he pays close attention to cultural institutions such as government and education, and how members of these institutions, the politicians, the professors, how these members of the institutions contribute to the reproduction of the capitalist system. In Gramsci's reading, we're looking at a theory of social control. So thinking back of updating, the Marxist readings here for updating the social control piece, that means we're looking at an updated version of the German ideology. So specifically, he's trying to explain the creation, the construction of hegemony through intellectuals. And how this occurs, he says, civil society. And by civil society, he's looking at specifically the institution of education. And the state, here we're looking at the institution of government. So how together civil society and the state, the institutions of formal education and the institution of government, produce what he calls organic intellectuals. Organic intellectuals are people that carry certain credentials granted to them by social institutions such as education, such as media. So you earn your MD, you earn your PhD, your Esquire, You are credentialed by government as a senator, as a representative, a press secretary. And with these credentials, the organic intellectual are recognized by the public as legitimate intellectuals. So the public sees these people, with their credentials provided to them by the institutions as people who know what they're talking about, as people who should be listening to seriously. The organic intellectual, goes through the system and ultimately represents the system that creates them. And the organic intellectual promotes what we call hegemonic ideas and messages. And by hegemonic, and by the idea of hegemony, we're talking about ideas and messages that are portrayed to the public as common sense. So, common sense is a very kind of power cultural force, because if you get people to think that what you're telling them is common sense, what you want them to do is common sense, then that's a heavy power over them, because they won't be questioning your motives. They won't be thinking about alternative ways. So the hegemonic thought presented to the public by the organic intellectual, whether it be the professor in the classroom, the politician campaigning, the hegemonic thoughts reproduces the capitalist system rather than challenging it. And so Gramsci believes this is a more effective social control method because the public doesn't recognize the professor, the MD, the lawyer, the politician as having a close interest in the capitalist system itself. Compared to, we can easily kind of smell something maybe a little off. We could easily question the motive when a banker or whatever capitalist person you want to talk about says that we need to keep the capitalist system growing. Of course, you think that way because it benefits you, but we don't see kind of the same motives behind the professor, behind the politician, because we see them as being more separate from the capitalist system compared to the capitalist her himself. So we can also add on to this that those who challenge the system, those who present alternative ideas, alternative messages, often lack the proper credentials. So you don't have the PhD, you're not the state senator, so you can talk all you want. People don't see your ideas as legitimate ideas. They don't see you as being legitimate. So although your ideas may be very sound and strong ideas, because you lack the credentials in the eyes of the public, you won't be taken seriously. Your ideas won't be taken seriously. Like Benjamin, Gramsci provides the possibility of resistance. So Marx talked about resistance through worker organization and unions. Benjamin talked about resistance through producing, alternative ideas for the public. Gramsci says that resistance is possible through what he calls revolutionary intellectuals. So a revolutionary intellectual is an intellectual who possesses the same needed credentials, the PhDs, the senator title, to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of the public. So they have the credentials that grant you that legitimacy, but rather than kind of giving the status quo, they provide the public alternative ways of thinking, alternative visions of a potential future. So here's where we see another focus on resistance from the two neo-Marxist. So finally get into the why. So why is it this way? What's that driving force? So the ways of thinking in a society must match the mode of production in that society. So if you run a capitalist system, you must have the public, you must have the masses thinking and embracing capitalist ways. So this is updating the German ideology, but the ways of thinking here are talked about as hegemonic thoughts, thoughts being passed on as common sense and being created by the professors and delivered to the students in the classroom, being created by the politicians and being distributed to the public on the campaign trail and the government. So we'll leave that there for now. Two kind of heavier, more abstract theories connected to European thought. Nevertheless, we'll get back to kind of the a little bit easier theories when we turn our attention back to American social thought in our next readings. So I'll leave that there for now. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions.